All right, guys. So today we're going to be getting into Syria as we continue our Unit 8 and international human rights crises. Obviously, Syria is probably one of the biggest things to currently think about in terms of ongoing conflict that's having a significant impact on life in Syria, as well as creating more of a global issue. Things are starting to improve, but this has been at the top of the topics of conversations for the last probably 10 years or so. So let's get into it here. So what is exactly going on in Syria? A lot of people hear, the war in Syria, but they don't actually know, who's at war, why are they at war, what is exactly is going on, and how is the United States involved in all of this. So what's happening in Syria is a civil war. It's an ongoing, multi-sided armed conflict. It's not just like the American Civil War where there were two sides. There are 10 different sides happening and all trying to fight each other at the same time during this current civil war happening in Syria. It originally would have been two sides, just rebels versus the government, but now things have evolved over the last, really since 2011, and it does not look like it did now when it began. So how has all of this began? We'll start with the president of Syria, which is Bashar al-Assad, or we'll just call him Assad for short. So Assad was elected, quote unquote, to the position of president of Syria after his father died in 2000, and his father was the previous president. So the Assad family has essentially been running Syria for the past I don't know, I'm going to say 80 or so years. They have a long history of socioeconomic inequality and human rights violations, freedom of expression, association, assembly, all very strictly controlled. From 1963 to 2011, when the civil war began, gatherings of 5 or more were actually banned in Syria. And authorities imprisoned and tortured critics of the Assad regime and of the Syrian government. So this is just your pretty standard, not necessarily a totalitarian government, but certainly a dictatorship exercising total control over people's lives. But in 2011, things began to change with a series of protests in various Arab countries known as the Arab Spring. That's really how we would consider all of this to have kicked off. So the Arab Spring actually began with the Tunisian Revolution from December of 2010 to December of 2012. These were nonviolent and violent demonstrations pushing for democracy, free elections, economic reform, human rights reform, employment, regime changes in various countries, and freedom of religion. It's, like I said, starts in Tunisia. But as it gains popularity, other Arabic countries experiencing similar problems begin to jump in, and that's why we don't just call it the Tunisian Revolution, we call it the Arab Spring, because it was happening all over the Arab world. It spread to Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Iraq, and of course, Syria. The civil war broke out in Syria when Arab Spring protesters and demonstrators were shot and killed by security forces. And that's when things went from just protests to full-blown civil war. Why were they protesting during that specific moment is because a 13-year-old Syrian boy spray painted some graffiti on a wall in Arabic. Basically what he wrote was, "The people want the fall of the government," and he was executed for that, a 13-year-old boy. And so demonstrators were protesting his execution when that's when security forces began to kill protesters, and now the whole thing has resulted in a civil war. So who is fighting? Like I said, it's not just two sides. Some of the sides you already know. Assad, of course, is one side, and his regime desperately trying to hold onto the control that he has had for the last 20 years or so. And he is being backed up by the Syrian Armed Forces, which is the actual army of the government of Syria. He's also being supported by outside groups like Russia and Iran, Hezbollah, various groups like that. And on top of that, he has the National Defense Force, which is almost like 100,000 troop militia that's also been helping him. He's been fighting the rebels more than he's been fighting ISIS, and we'll get to ISIS's involvement in a minute, but who's like also a factor in all of this, but a bulk of his energy has been spent fighting the rebel forces, and he has been largely successful with that. He has maintained control in Syria, and as we're entering a period that looks like peace and potentially an end to the civil war sometime within the next couple of years, it he's been able to come out on the other side looking like he's gonna maintain his current position, and he's been using chemical weapons to target rebels, hitting civilian sites as well. Just in January of 2020, January of this year, Assad and Russia launched airstrikes on a rebel hospital and a bakery, killing civilians in Syria. So this is still ongoing. I don't want to act like just because they reached, some peace agreements in certain areas of Syria, establishing buffer zones and things like that at the end of 2019. I don't want you to think that the fighting is over and that the death toll has begun to stop. That's not at all true. There's still a lot going on. Now, the other groups, the main rebel group is the Free Syrian Army that you see up there in the top left. They were formed by some of the Syrian army defectors in July of 2011 when the war began, who wanted to defend civilians against government violence. There's not nearly as many of them as there are the actual Syrian armed forces, but the Free Syrian Army is being supported by the U.S. government, Great Britain, France, and other Western countries. The United States alone has offered about $123 million in aid to the Free Syrian Army. But in return for that aid, we've also requested that they turn their efforts to not only fight Assad, but to also fight ISIS. So while the Free Syrian Army is fighting Assad and the Syrian armed forces, both of those sides are also fighting ISIS at the same time. Then you have the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF. Now, the SDF is not, they are not ethnically Syrians. There are people who are not Syrians who live in Syria who have no political rights. In Syria, you basically have to be Syrian to vote, but or to have any type of political power. But there are plenty of other groups. There are Assyrians and Armenians and Kurds and Turks, and they all want to fight for a true democracy. And so these are basically people who are also fighting. They're not necessarily in an alliance with the Free Syrian Army. They are just also fighting the Syrian armed forces. They're opposed to Assad, but have also spent a large amount of their resources on fighting ISIS. There are probably about 100,000 of the SDF. They have a fairly large Christian influence as well, which is kind of interesting considering most of Syria is Arabic and Muslim. So the last group before I get to ISIS is the Salafi Jihadists, and those are basically terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda that are not ISIS. They're separate terrorist cells that are fighting against Assad and his regime in order to maintain control of the territory. And they're not fighting really the sides that we are supporting. So kind of the policy that has been adopted by all of these groups is sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We aren't working with Salafi Jihadists, but we're also not targeting them while they're also fighting ISIS and Assad, because that's who we're fighting, and the more people fighting them, the better in our mind and in the minds of the people that we're supporting. Now, of course, one of the biggest issues here happening during the Syrian civil war is what has gone on with ISIS. So ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Sometimes you hear it called ISIL, which is Iraq and the Levant, which is essentially the region of Syria, just sort of like the biblical vocabulary to describe it. They're currently controlling smaller portions of northern Syria than they have in the past. At one point, they were controlling massive parts of northern Syria. They've split off from Al-Qaeda in 2014. They, at their peak, had about 7,000 fighters, but things are significantly dying down for ISIS, as not only have they been fighting Assad, Salafi Jihadists, the SDF, the Free Syrian Army, Russia, and the United States, in fighting all of those different groups who might be fighting each other, but they're all also fighting ISIS, that there's finally been sort of some leeway, and we don't necessarily consider ISIS to no longer be a threat, but they're not necessarily as large of as a factor as they were when this war was certainly at its peak. Now that things have begun to die out, a lot of ISIS fighters have actually left Iraq and tried to move to Syria, because things are like the Iraqis have really been able to find some success in fighting ISIS. And so a lot of the ISIS fighters are trying to now focus on Syria instead of Iraq, but that's just allowing other groups to put more resources into fighting in Syria than they did in Iraq, since there are more ISIS fighters there now. So it's pretty much only a matter of time before that all comes to an end as well. So really, what's the humanitarian impact on this? That's why we're talking about this here. What has happened in Syria? There are wars all over the world all of the time, but what has happened in Syria has turned into one of the largest, if not the largest, humanitarian crises we have seen in probably the last 50 years or so, definitely within the last decade. As far as the financial impact of this goes, the United Nations agencies that focus on humanitarian help have requested close to $7 billion to aid Syria since 2013. The death toll is constantly still rising. In 2016, or I think it might not have been 2016. I think it was like 2019. They estimated that the total death toll now be around 400,000, with close to 2 million or more wounded. Like I said, that's still rising all of the time. We're seeing more civilian deaths. Of those 400,000, probably close to 100,000 are civilians. They literally had to stop counting death tolls because the numbers were rising too fast around 2013, 2014. That's when things were getting really, really bad. And we estimate that between 5 and 10,000 of those civilian deaths were actually children. And because of how large this war has become, of course, the death toll of the war is a crisis, but it has led to so many other problems. For example, disease. Because living situations have gotten so bad. I mean, we're looking at close to 3.8 million refugees coming out of Syria, and another and with aside from that 3.8 million, another almost 8 million total people have been displaced from their homes in Syria. Living conditions have gotten so bad that diseases are running rampant. Measles, typhoid, hepatitis, dysentery, tuberculosis, skin diseases, and now COVID-19 as well. Hospitals have extremely limited supplies. Only about half of Syrian hospitals are actually still operating. And aside from this, we're also seeing rising crime rates outside of the war. We're seeing a significant rise in sexual assaults, mass looting, a rise in organized crime, black market weapon sales. And then, of course, what the rest of the world is dealing with from this is a massive refugee crisis. A bulk of these refugees have been sent to Lebanon and Turkey and a few Eastern European countries. Germany has agreed to take a fair amount of Syrian refugees as well. The United Nations has dumped millions of dollars into setting up refugee camps right outside of Syria, but these camps are nothing glamorous. There's still food shortages and lack of medical supplies and true medical attention. So until the fighting actually stops, it'll be really difficult to actually address the humanitarian crisis that is happening now. So the only way to truly stop the humanitarian issues from getting constantly worse is for the fighting to stop. And honestly, it'll stop. A lot of people estimate that it could be another year, even after the fighting is over, before they get a true grip on the humanitarian toll that this has had on the Syrian people.